Hello everyone, my name is Daniel and I'm from group 7 and I'm gonna tackle about utilitarianism. So first of all, what is utilitarianism? So utilitarianism is a theory of morality which advocates that an action is right insofar as it promotes happiness and that the greatest happiness of the greatest number should be the guiding principle of conduct. Before we proceed, let me ask you a question. If an act benefits a lot of people, even though some may suffer as a consequence, was it a moral act? So, in this lesson, we are going to explore the ethical theory of utilitarianism, which is founded by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Let me introduce you to one of the founders of utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham is known as the founder of utilitarianism. He was born in 1748 in London to a father who was a prosperous lawyer at the time. He was sent to school at the age of 7 in Westminster School, then graduated from Queen's College, Oxford at 15. Some of his famous works in philosophy are Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislations and Fragment on Government. One of the book of David Hume entitled Treatise of Human Nature influenced Jeremy Bentham to believe in the theory of utility. After reading this book, he started to believe in the theory of utility and established his own classical version of utilitarianism, which is now being studied by many. Origins and nature of theory. As Filipino people, we are all familiar with these two people named Andres Bonifacio and Jose Rizal. They are known as our national heroes. We learn from the history that they died fighting for their country's liberty. They did not die for nothing because their death ignites the spirit of liberty and independence among Filipino people. Their death somehow shows an act of utility since they died not just for themselves but for the greater number of people. It is also done by Jesus and his followers, as we all know that Jesus died on the cross to pay for our sins. Jesus' action shows an act of utility since he didn't care about the consequences, which is being nailed on the cross just to grant mankind salvation. Their acts are all for the sake of mankind. David Hume was the first to introduce the concept of utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, on the other hand, have given the theory more depth and profundity. But in this lesson, we are just gonna focus to the classical version of utilitarianism by Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham's traditional interpretation of utilitarianism is summarized into three parts.
First is, the basis for an act to be treated as morally right or wrong is in its consequence they produced. It is known as consequentialism. The second is, what matters in every act that we do would be the amount of pleasure produced. The third is, which is the happiness experienced by every person is counted the same.
So the first is that an act's moral rightness or wrongness is determined by the consequences it produces. The second point is that the quantity of pleasure we derive from each deed is what matters. And lastly, the third point is that everyone's pleasure is measured in the same way. So this just means that if the amount of happiness or pleasure is greater than pain, then the act is good.
So there are six factors to consider in assessing an act. First is, happiness pleasure should be more intense. Second is, happiness pleasure should last longer. Third is, happiness pleasure should be more certain to occur. The fourth one is, happiness pleasure should be happening sooner rather than later. Fifth, happiness pleasure will produce in turn many happiness and few pains. And last but not the least, in determining the amount of happiness pleasure, one has to consider how many people will be affected.
Therefore, the correct acts are those that result in the greatest possible balance of pleasure over sadness, with each person's pleasure valued equally.